Hey, uh, this is Ready, Set, Engage, episode 20. The normal disclaimer: the views expressed here represent mine and mine alone, do not reflect that of any organization that I'm affiliated with. Um, there's really one topic today that I wanted to talk about, or that caught my attention the most, but the other things sort of played in, so I figured we'd sort of tie them all together. So the three topics I listed in the post are Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane, for those who aren't aware, is a very famous black and white film. I believe it was 1930s or 40s, and it really sort of transcended the film genre at the time and did some stuff that just um, totally blew people's mind as far as how a video should be filmed and how it actually plays out. I didn't look at how loud my audio is, so if it's not loud enough, let me know, and I'll move the camera down closer. But this sort of plays into the talk on Citizen Kane. The second part is I started reading a book, and I'm 5 pages in, which generally by 5 pages you shouldn't judge a book, but I'm already frustrated. And so it's called Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and it's written by Carl Jung. For those who aren't aware, Carl Jung was a very famous psychologist. Basically, he's the founder of analytical psychology, I believe, is the right term for it. And he does a lot on the interpretation of dreams. So there's just in the start of the book, he has an interpretation. Found myself frustrated. And then the last topic, of course, is fear. And so hopefully the trend will play in. Thank you, Lorraine. So Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane, again, was a black and white film. It came out in like the 1930s or 40s. I wish I should have pulled up like the IMDb so I was articulate on when it came out. But one of the things that it did in Citizen Kane is it actually changed the camera angle. And so it was, I believe it won Academy Awards or whatever was there at the time, because they took and they changed the camera angles to change the perspective of what you're actually seeing within the frame. They actually, I believe they patented it, but they drilled holes in the ground. And I mean, when you're talking about cameras back then, you're talking about large ass cameras. You know, they were still reel to reel. So they drilled holes in the ground or made cavities in the ground such that they could put the camera in the ground and then face up and look at the actors. And so like you had these really cool visuals of almost like the full body of individuals, and it was coming up at them. So the focal point, yeah, the face was in the frame, but the focal point was actually telling you how big and almost strong or powerful at that point in the movie that they were. And so like filmography wise, it was absolutely groundbreaking. And even today, you don't really see that many movies that are being that that sort of risky in their portrayal or their use of filmography. Of course, you talk about Bye Bye Birdie and the Michael Bay sort of stuff where he's trying to get 3 levels of the frame, and that's a little bit different. Obviously, it's stole from I think it's Bye Bye Birdie in the 80s or whatever. What's the one with the sharks and they do the dancing? Anyway, so from a film perspective, it's very interesting. And what's most interesting about this isn't necessarily that it changed how you do film. Like a lot of people didn't actually take on or take away those same effects or those same techniques. It's kind of a standout and lives yet till today. Baby Shark. I don't know if I told you that when we were in North Carolina, that was our theme song for the first deployment I was on. So every day we'd get in the truck and a fellow named Zach would play Baby Shark, or our strike team leader would pull it up on his phone. It was hilarious. And so we would all do the dance, and Baby Shark's awesome. But so it changed the perspective and the way you look at filmography and the way that you look at that interaction, right? Which is just basically a different frame of reference for how you're engaging with the movie, what you're learning or what your relationship with that movie is, right? So Citizen Kane, absolutely groundbreaking. If you get a chance, at least check out little portions of it to see sort of what I'm talking about. I'm great movie. So the book, hey John. The book I'm reading, it's called Modern Man in Search of a Soul. It's actually very funny because I got too much time on my hands right now, which is obvious, especially for those who are close to me. And so I was like, oh, I'll go to the library and I'll buy or check out some books by Carl Jung. Carl Jung, a very popular psychologist, basically came after Freud. Some would say he rationalized Freud's theories. I don't know. I'm yet to find out. And so I started looking, and all of his books are like backdated. They've got 8 different people waiting in the line. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm never going to get one of his books there. So I looked on the Amazons and I found Modern Man in Search of a Soul. I was like, well, that's interesting and sounds like something I would enjoy, and it's entertaining. So Carl Jung was very notable for his analysis of dreams, which isn't too different from Freud, if I remember right. Like I think he's got a book about interpretation of dreams. But Carl Jung says basically that your first dream when you report to or when you start talking to a psychiatrist, psychologist, or a clinician often tends to be the most important. So he gives this example, and I had to write down notes on it because it frustrated me. But so he starts talking about the analysis of dreams. He says there's this guy who's relatively successful, and the guy came into him. The guy used to be in a small community, a village. His parents didn't go to college, weren't highly educated, etc. And one of the dreams that the man kept having was that he would go back to his town, and he was wandering through the village, and the other kids in the village would look at him and say something like, he doesn't come around very often. Okay. So that's one dream. I think it's interesting. Doesn't come around very often. You could probably add a couple of connotations to that. The connotation that was added in the book was basically that he was too good for the community now, or he was uppity, or whatever. And so it was sort of a negative connotation to his interaction with the community. And sort of what Jung does is he says that your conscious is what you're aware of, and your unconscious is sort of this phenomenon that exists that is an absolute or is always truthful, right? So you want to listen to your unconscious because it's not perverted or polluted by your views throughout the day or your cognition and logic. Okay. Which means when you're unconscious and you're having a dream, then the dream should be more real, earnest, or truthful than what you would experience in day-to-day life. Interesting idea. So the first one is he goes back to the village, and the kids basically say we don't see him around that often. So the idea that Jung pulls from that is that obviously, he's grown too big for that community, and he thinks too highly of himself. And so when he goes back, he doesn't really relate. The second thing, or the second dream that the man talks about, he basically says that he has this dream where there's a freight train, and this freight train's getting ready to move, and he's sure he's got all his bags packed, and he goes back to make sure that he has everything, and he grabs sort of that one last thing, and as he's coming back, the train takes off without him. Okay, so now you've got this heavy train, and it's moving down the tracks, and there's a bend in the tracks. And so as he's sitting there and he's visualizing the tracks, he thinks, oh, that train's moving too fast. It can't go that fast, because if it goes so fast, that in cars, as they curve around the track, will actually pivot off and derail. And so he has this thought and expresses it in his dream. And Jung takes from that, and he says, well, basically there's two things that come from that. The first is your first dream is you've left that town and you've grown too big for it, and you're continuing to move forward. The second one is almost like a fear mechanic, which is saying, if you continue on the path that you're on, continuing to strive forward, or to believe that you're bigger and better than what you're currently achieving, and that you deserve more, then you're on a path for failure. And so basically Jung tells him this. He's like, you should be happy, more or less. I'm paraphrasing, of course. You can read the book. I'm 5 pages in, so it's a $5 book. But he paraphrases it as be happy with your post. Don't strive for anything more. You've already achieved greatness. But if you try to achieve more, you're going to fail. And then he writes this anecdote, and it's translated, of course, because Jung was, I think, Swedish. But he writes this anecdote that later the man failed. He had reached too far, applied for positions that he wasn't really ready for, and then wound up falling. And so, ta-da, Jung was right, and he shouldn't have done that. Here's my problem with that. Well, I've got a couple problems with that. First of all, like by Jung telling him that as a clinician, right, as a psychiatrist, psychologist, or whatever he was deemed at the time. I don't know the vernacular of that day. I think it was. I think he died in 1961 or something. So almost 100 years ago was when he was actually practicing and writing these books. Did he corrupt that man's vision, though? So when you talk about neurolinguistic programming, or you talk about hypnosis, basically one of the key things that you try and do is you try and set up that you're an expert on this given thing, right? So Jung being an expert on dreams, and the person that's writing all this stuff, and a clinician, you would expect that he would have some expertise in the field, right? So all of a sudden you're starting to persuade based on position, right? Appeal to authority, as opposed to necessarily the merit of the conversation at hand. So that's thing one that bothers me a little bit. Like, I don't think it's Jung's place to actually project that onto the individual. If the individual comes up with that, maybe that's a different thing. But the way it's framed in the book is very much that Jung told him, hey, this is what your dreams mean. And then the man went on and failed later. So first problem, I think that Jung, by merit of position and by merit of his confidence in whatever position he was putting forth, whether good, bad, or indifferent. Like, I don't necessarily mean he was meaning to be a bad person or to injure another person, but by merit of it, I think that he did have an influence on that person, almost like a butterfly effect. The second thing is, were the dreams open to a different interpretation? And so, like, what I mean by that, I actually wrote down an interpretation. What could the first dream, where he goes back to the town and people don't really greet him, and the kids say, oh, he doesn't really come visit that often, could that have been that he possibly outgrew that community and his values had changed since he moved on from that community, right? Just from survival in a small tribal or poverty-stricken community into success in the larger world, right? Just moved on, found something bigger, and now it's harder to relate to the people back there. Is it possible, plausible? I think so, and it's a differentiated interpretation from what Jung came up with. The second part related to the train, right? So he sees the train, he has this thought, and the thought is, hey, if the train continues that speed, it's going to derail, right? And so Jung's interpretation was that means, hey, your career and your life are going to derail. If you continue at the speed and trajectory you're on, you should figure out a way to plateau, level out, and be comfortable in your stay. What if it was different? What if he took the interpretation of, hey, that means that you have a message that is utterly important and critical to share to the people within your purview, and if you don't share it with them, they could derail, face life and death, etc. Like, now all of a sudden there's a savior complex that could be interpreted from that same dream. And I'm not saying these are right. I'm just saying, when you think about this, it becomes that I'm hard pressed to find that there's only one interpretation for dreams. One. And two, that Jung had it correct. And three, that it was Jung's place to actually project this on or share this with the individual. I really think he wound up screwing the person over, assuming that the story is as it plays out in the book. So the next part is, if Jung had taken that differentiated interpretation or understanding, could he have driven the person to better behavior, right? If you believe that you're destined for greatness and you keep searching for greatness, I dare say that you're going to find something that is great. That doesn't mean that the end all be all of the greatness that you're looking for. It means that you may make a sizable or noticeable impact to the people around you, whether or not you pause and give deference to that, right? Like, whether or not you pause and say, oh, I did something fucking good today. And so I'm 5 pages in, and already I'm frustrated with the book. And unfortunately, this book is this book and others by Carl Jung are some of the foundational sort of understandings that Jordan Peterson goes by, which probably means I'm going to find a lot more that I disagree with here, and thus later on to disagree with on his positions or his views. The next thing I guess is fear or sort of interpretation, and so I wanted to stay away from an interpretation. I really want to. I would like to sit down and write about my last week in North Carolina. I think it's a completely different experience than I had anticipated having down there. One, because I don't know if I had fully recovered from 2 weeks prior when I was down there. So like I went down there, I was still a bit emotional. I was still yeah, there's almost like an apathy that goes along with it, or sort of a vapidness of experience that you have when you return from those things. And so I really don't think I took enough time to recover, unfortunately. So my first couple of days were not where I would have preferred them to be, and I was starting to question, like, I guess what value I was having, which is just a bad spot to be, especially when you're volunteering, with so many people, so many incredible volunteers that actually are there to get shit done and do great work. And then an interesting thing happened to me about middle of the week. I got changed to a different position now. So from a historical perspective, I've served in a number of leadership positions. I've led operations, and I've also been just like, hey, tear shit up, like not tear shit up, sorry. Muck out houses, clear out debris, clear out stuff that's damaged by the natural disasters, which isn't shit. It's actually like lives, and that's an important distinction. Apologies for framing it in the first way. It is very manual labor. It is very grueling, etc. And so this time I went down, and there was no presuppositions. I assumed there were going to be more people from our area, and we wound up going to a base that actually only had like 4 of us, which was interesting in and of itself. But I think it was actually good because I got to meet a lot of people from all over the U.S., a lot of people from Boston, and I love their accent. They're phenomenal. It's so fun to listen here and try and engage with it. I probably picked jokes at it a bit too. What was somebody used the word entrande instead of entendre, and it made me giggle, and we had a whole conversation about him actually like carrying the R into that word, and I thought it was hilarious. Anyway, so the last 3 days, like, I wasn't clearing out houses. Instead, I wound up doing what's known as swamping. And so swamping is basically like if trees fall in the storm, or if they're liable to fall in the next storm, then we'll wind up clearing those out. There was actually a tree that tore up a shed that fell over a shed. So we cut that down into chunks and then loaded it out. A number of trees that just fell over in the storm, same sort of thing. And then there was like 100, and I don't know, it was between like probably 80 and 100 feet. And we tore that down, and then we stacked it into a burn pile. And it was fun. It was very labor intensive, a lot of sweat. I got like scrapes and cuts all up and down my arm, some on my shoulder. But like, it's fun. It's not inherently easy, but it was fabulous for me because I got to disconnect from the cognitive aspect and just go into the, hey, I'm going to do work and get something done. And like, I'm actually very appreciative of that opportunity. I learned a great amount about that, about Sawyer, which is actually like felling the trees, cutting down the trees, how to look for where the anchor points are on the tree, such that you're cutting in a spot that isn't going to snap back at you and stuff. Like, it was a phenomenal learning experience, even though I'm not qualified to cut down a tree with a chainsaw. It will be one day. But it sort of brings me back to that interpretation, right? That events happen, and there's multiple interpretations that can spawn from any given set of events. And so for Young, he had those dreams. He assumed the negative and then said, hey, you've reached your maximal potential. Stay where you are, shut the fuck up, and have a nice day, loosely paraphrased, versus saying, hey, you have a lot of opportunity. If you make sure that your voice is heard, you have the capability to help others find a writing speed, course of action, or trajectory on the train such that you can save them from a catastrophe. It's just a different view on the same events or the same dream that happened. with the last deployment, like I started looking at it as I don't know that I'm having the impact I want to have, and so on and so forth, and started getting really negative about it, and that really sort of clouded my first couple of days. And then at the end, we got to this really fascinating moment. It was fascinating for me because for me, and there were great people on this deployment. I don't want to cast aspersions at any of that, but for me, the way that things played out were not optimal to me. Like I would have preferred them to be. I would have had a different mindset in how I stage things, people, how I interact, how I communicate with people, especially. That's not to say that what happened was wrong. It's just to say that I would have it very different. And so like the whole time I was thinking, wow, this is almost an oddity. Like if I had to grade my deployments, and I've only had 5, which isn't a lot. I would say that this was probably my least favorite. And somebody, it was actually a Bostonian, which makes it even funner. Somebody was like, "This is the best organization and deployment I've ever been on. Everyone is awesome. All these aspects are awesome." And it was very different from my opinion, but it was like, okay, well, maybe my opinion or my view on things aren't necessarily truth. And in fact, there's a lot to glean from the other experiences that happen here. It's a long way of saying that with fear, it becomes sort of an interpretation, right? Your fear of something is only as valid as your belief in that thing. And so I drink. I don't know if you guys know this. I have a drink or two from time to time. And people have asked me, well, why do you drink? And the answer lies something along the frame of reference of I don't like dreams. I don't like having dreams and nightmares. I would prefer to avoid them. Omar hasn't noticed that I drink. All right, best friends. I don't like having dreams. And I think I've talked before on one of these that I believe that dreams are sort of the creative aspect of our mind trying to build a storyline or a narrative out of the experiences that we've had within the day. So they'll be loosely tied to what we experienced that day. They'll try to create a narrative or evaluation system. And so there's a lot of possibilities that play out when we dream. That doesn't mean that they're always right or they're inherently true or based on some unconscious that knows better than we know, any of that stuff. I believe that they're actually just creativity showing its head. Unfortunately for me, creativity isn't always a positive thing, and so I prefer to avoid them. I haven't been able to lately, and that's a little bit frustrating in and of itself. But it's also an interesting opportunity to take another perspective or another opportunity to think about the way I analyze the world around me. I really, really want to create videos and go have this, and I've talked about it as a potential nonprofit or side idea to go talk to people that are homeless and hear their story and help share their story. I think that there's a great and tremendous value in listening to everybody. And I think that oftentimes we it's almost like we ignore or we avoid people who are it's not even like lesser on the hierarchical ladder. It's just in a differentiated position that's removed from ours. And so it seems to me that people discount homeless people much more than like anyone else. And I don't understand the logic. Like, I think that they're all human, so much the same as all of us. And they probably have fascinating stories. In fact, their stories probably have more tragedy and overcoming than a lot of ours, especially if we're living the day-to-day grind and not focusing on that sort of extremity of outcome. And so I really want to I really want to start a thing, not ready, set, engage, because obviously this has its trajectory of me just sitting in front of a camera and pontificating for way too long. Fair. Uh, but start a thing where they're able to share the story, and it's not about me. It's a part of it would be like me asking questions or me trying to get them to share their story and then look at where they're going or what the plan is. But I've been so afraid of it because I keep doing the trajectory of, or the sort of thought mapping of, what if I go and I start talking to them and they ignore me? They decide that they don't want to talk to me. They decide that, what the fuck is this guy doing? He doesn't know what the hell, what I've been through. I can't relate to him in any way, and so on and so forth. And so I keep coming up with all these rash, unfounded, really, rationalizations that I don't have any value to add back to that community as I'm trying to help share their story. And that's really a struggle I've been dealing with mentally over the last couple of weeks. Like I haven't figured it out, right? Which isn't too different from what a lot of people face. If you're, a high school guy, you probably think the same thing on, what do I have to offer some girl? And so why would I talk to her? She's just going to reject me, and so on and so forth. And so I shouldn't really be afraid of rejection. It's sort of go out and engage and see how it plays out, which is very much why I started these in the first place. And so I guess this is a nice way of saying I'm kind of being a pussy and not engaging in a spot that I really want to, because I'm thinking through the hypotheticals and I'm creating this negative thought trajectory that says, oh, I'll never make that happen, make it work, make people want to talk to me or be able to share the story in a way that I really want to. So I guess the long and short of this is, one, it's a different way to look at camera angle, which is simply perspective from the person that's filming or the person that's creating the experience. So given a differentiated camera angle here, I'm able to talk about how perspective can change based on what your vantage point is. It also means that there's differentiated viewpoints for whatever phenomena you're experiencing in life, whether that's a dream in the case of Jung, or whether for me that's this concept of what I would really like to do and how I keep finding all the reasons that it'll never work, it'll never happen, and so on. And I guess the punchline of it is that that there are a lot of different interpretations, and sometimes finding that positive interpretation for the experience that you're in can help you frame your experience such that you can be successful, so long as you keep the goal in mind. And I suppose that inherently that means my homework now is to think of a frame of reference in which I'm able to do that, to frame it in a positive light that it can and will be successful, but not everything is going to be a success. I'm okay to fail a number of times in my attempts to bring those stories forward. I'm able to get rejected a number of times as I try and interact with people and get them to share their story candidly with somebody that they've never met before, and who knows if I'll meet them again. And I think that the value to be had in this is sort of the goes back to a lot of psychological studies that basically say, like, if people don't know what they're going to win in the end, either they'll be incited to do it or they'll decide that's not worthwhile, and thus avoid some experience where they're unclear on what the payoff will be. But I think that the coaching strategy that I have in mind for how these conversations will play out is a value add and a net value add. That doesn't mean that it's the big sexy to attract people over to just talk to me. It just simply means that I believe there is something I have to offer in these conversations. And I suppose that's all that I got today. Like, perspective, interpretation of dreams might be some bullshit and probably open to further interpretation. And then, of course, fear and how it's simply a vantage point or a short-term value system for how you interpret the world around you, totally capable of being overcome as long as you putting yourself in a path to overcome it or to rationalize it over time. That's all I got. Thanks for watching. That's Ready, Set, Engage, episode 20.